At the edge of the morning market, where awnings stitched from sackcloth breathed like lungs in the heat, a boy pressed his palm to the glass of a bakery case and fogged it with a small, slow circle. He had not eaten since yesterday's noon. The bread, long loaves with a lacquered crust, a braided ring dusted white as the road to the mill, watched him back, an indifferent choir. Coins clinked in grown-up pockets behind him. He had none. He had a name, Amir, and a mother home sick with a cough that rattled like beans in a tin. He stood too long at the door, and doors are a kind of sermon in a city like this. What is kept in, what is kept out. The baker, Karim, worked the counter with flour on his wrists, and his assistant, Fatima, moved like water between tray and till. They saw the boy, then saw the line. The ledger called the morning's account. The hour called the bread. Hunger is a wound that shows itself early. It pulls at posture, hollows the eyes, makes a child stare too long at a gate. The market had gates everywhere. Metal shutters rolled up like eyelids, ranks of padlocks as though the city had multiplied the word no in brass. One gate led to the police post, a square room with a fan that did little. Another gate, really a door painted municipal brown, led to a social office that opened late and closed early. There were forms in there, carbon paper, a stamp that slept more than it worked. If you were hungry, official relief required a document, and the document required a fee, and the fee required what hunger had already taken. The boy's breath came faster as the first customers finished and the street swelled. He did not plan to steal, not in the way the law imagines premeditation. He counted his mother's coughs. He counted the steps to home. He counted the loaves, and one of them, because hunger sometimes selects for us, became the only line that mattered in the day's ledger. He waited for the moment when Fatima glanced at change. When Karim turned to the oven, and he slipped a hand into the case and took the braided ring. It was soft where it yielded and rough where flour clung. He ran. Karim shouted, not from malice, but from reflex. The way a man shouts when the gate he is responsible for is lifted without his hand. A customer caught the cry like a baton and threw it forward. The market has guards, blue shirts with ironed badges and shoes that squeak where puddles gather. One of them, Aziz, turned on his heel and gave chase. He was young enough to remember his own boyhood hunger, and old enough to know his sergeant's ledger, petty theft tallies that paid for copy paper and fuel and overtime tea. The boy was faster than he should have been on such little food, but hunger runs hot. He reached the alley between the spice stall and the mechanic's den, and there he found another gate, chain-linked, that barbed him with no entry. He turned, clutching the bread to his chest like a second rib. The guard closed the distance, hand outstretched. By then the news had learned to walk. WhatsApp lit up with a picture. A blurry boy, bread in his arms. The caption a little cruel because hunger isn't photogenic on small screens. The baker's pride bruised against the boy's desperation, and the market crowd made its own court in murmurs. Someone said, make him pay or make him learn. Someone else said, his mother. In this dense, ordinary theater of gates and ledgers, the story had already found its obstacle in a person with authority but little discretion. Sergeant Baco, who ran the post with a coffee-stained smile and a drawer that smelled like coins. When he arrived, the badge became a door that closed. He took the bread from Amir with a tiny flourish, as if to restore order by reversing time. He told the boy to sit on a plastic chair by the fan. He told Karim to file a complaint, which meant a form numbered in blue at the top, a line for losses, a line for witness. He told Fatima not to weep, because pity is messy in a room that prefers neat lists. He told Aziz to draft the statement and to be careful with the verbs. Hunger does not conjugate well in official language. By then, the day had settled into its first heat. The first heat always decides the afternoon. The market breathed in, breathed out, and waited to see if the door would ever open again. Beyond the market, in a government building whose steps had been scrubbed into a kind of pale honesty, Ibrahim, the leader, finished a meeting on road repairs and flipped his notebook closed. He moved with a quiet authority that had less spectacle than gravity. He had a habit of reading ledgers when others read headlines. A message slid under his attention like a paper across a table. Starving boy, bread, Sergeant Baco, police post. The word starving opened a door in his mind that had a common hinge with justice. He stood, because the day had just rewritten its own agenda, and an agenda is only a list until someone walks through the door it draws. In the hot, humming room where the fan shifted dust rather than air, the boy tried not to stare at the bread now settled on the sergeant's desk, its braided body broken where panic had pressed it. The door to the post clicked and unclicked, admitting a parade of everyday grievances. A neighbor and a fence line, a bus driver and a scraped fender, a hawker with counterfeit stamps. Each complaint was a stone dropped into the same ledgered pond, ripples touching the boy's ankles. Baco worked the forms with the boredom of a man who had become the gate. The gate smiled when it should have opened and closed when it should have learned. Karim arrived, wiping his hands on his apron, contrition and anger mixed like flour and water in his voice. He was a good man in a bad sentence. He looked at the boy and saw not an enemy, but a hole in a system he had been taught to trust. But the baker's shop had just paid its taxes. The receipt still warm in his pocket. The city asked him for cleanliness, for a scale that told the truth, for a shutter that locked at night. The city did not ask him to know where the line between hunger and theft lived. He signed the complaint because the sergeant's pen hovered and because the gatekeeper's eyebrows lifted in that way, suggesting a lesson about order. Fatima stood behind him, mouth set, eyes wet. She had put aside a heel of bread in a napkin that she would later slip to the cleaning woman. She kept touching her own rib, where the boy had hugged the loaf, as if matching bone to bread could soften bureaucratic calculus. Outside, a small crowd grew like a shadow that figures out it is a shape. The market's voice, communal and contradictory, found pitch. An older man in a faded cap, Isa, spoke with the authority that comes from spending a lifetime near gates. He had once been a porter at the railway yard when trains mattered more, and he remembered a protocol that fed night shift workers soup before their shift, not after. He said loudly that no boy should be booked before being fed. It sounded like common sense and treason all at once. Mothers joined, a chorus that repeats a single vowel until it becomes a demand. The obstruction was not only a man, but a mechanism. Baco's drawer housed slips for on-the-spot fines, in triplicate. The station's budget leaned on those slips the way a tired man leans on a post. Each petty offense was a coin, and coins are heavy enough to tilt morals. The more minor cases moved across the desk, the smoother the drawer moved in its rails. There was a monthly tally that traveled upstairs, and the upstairs liked its numbers neat and rising. Hunger, reduced to a column labeled theft, fed the station even as it starved the city's conscience. When Karim suggested, timidly, that perhaps the boy could work off the bread sweeping the shop, the sergeant lifted a finger and pointed to a laminated poster on the wall. It announced, with the confidence of clip art, the penalties for common crimes. The schedule did not include the word hungry. At midday, the room received heat like an ancestor. The fan ticked. The boy's head fogged. He was asked to sign a statement he could not read, and his name, Amir, tried to stand up inside the letters. Aziz, the guard with the conflict stitched into his posture, watched the pen hover in the boy's trembling hand. He remembered his own mother queuing outside the same social office years ago with a folder too thin to convince anyone her need was real. He cleared his throat. He said they should wait for a guardian or the teacher or someone. Baco glanced at the wall clock. He had a quota to make by Friday, and quotas move the hand of a clock as surely as battery. WhatsApp, which never tires, spread a new detail. The boy had stolen bread, but had first asked for the price. That single line opened a second ledger, the one people keep in their minds. By the afternoon, an aide in Ibrahim's office, Aisha, had assembled those fragments into a timeline on her tablet. Each message a small bead pushed along a wire. 0740 boy at window, 0805 theft, 0810 chase, 0813 apprehension, 0820 booking. She looked up and said, soft but urgent, that if a child could be processed faster for punishment than a sick mother could be processed for aid, then the city had built the wrong door. Ibrahim listened, the way a carpenter listens to wood for the place it will split if he presses too hard. He said two words that started moving people like a tide. I'm coming. In the market, word performed its sprint. The taxi slowed, then idled. A reporter appeared with a phone and a battery pack that bulged like a second phone. The bakery's oven coughed heat into the street, and the bread continued to rise because bread knows nothing of decrees. Fatima pulled loaves, arranged them, and said nothing because she understood that sometimes silence is the only way to keep pity intact in a place that wants to pry it into spectacle. Inside the post, the air changed. You can feel when a door is about to open. The sergeant adjusted his collar. He checked the drawer, though he knew what slept there. The boy watched the bread on the desk, with an attention that made everything else smaller. Outside, a car door thumped shut, a simple sound that told the market the day was about to pick a side. He entered without escort, which was itself a statement. Ibrahim did not bring cameras. They followed him anyway. He paused at the threshold as if asking the door for permission to be more than wood and paint. The room was not ready for humility wearing authority. It looked around for arrogance and could not find it. He took the measure of the space as a doctor takes a pulse, the fan, the poster of penalties, the drawer not fully closed, the bread on the desk, the boy on the chair. He greeted the sergeant by name. He greeted the guard who had run, and the baker who had shouted, and the assistant who had not. He greeted the boy last, not because he counted least, but because he wanted to arrive at him, having walked through the gatekeepers, so that the gate might learn its rank. A moment like this needs a breath before billing, a pause in which a city remembers what a child looks like when the ledger is set aside. Ibrahim lowered himself to the boy's height. He asked his name and did not rush the syllables. He asked if he had eaten. The boy shook his head. Ibrahim looked at Fatima and Karim with a gentleness that still managed to be a command. Could the bakery spare a piece? Fatima folded a portion of the braided ring in paper and placed it in the boy's hand. The room held itself still to watch him chew. A law was still a law, and a theft still a theft, but the order of operations had been reordered. Breath, then billing. Bread, then booking. The sergeant found his voice in a clause. He said procedure, and then he said deterrent, and then he reached for his laminated poster, as if law were a picture you could hold up against hunger and expect hunger to retreat. Ibrahim did not raise his tone. He pointed at the desk and asked who had written the schedule, who had decided the fine would be collected immediately in cash, and who had decided the station would keep a percentage for administrative costs. The drawer answered before the sergeant did. It scraped, guilty timber. Ibrahim touched the edge of the poster with 2 fingers and turned it face down as if to cool it. He said the city did not tax compassion. He said the city would stop taxing it by accident. Aisha, the aide, had followed him in with her tablet open to a blank note already titled with a date and a phrase, First Meal Rule. She observed the room the way an auditor observes a ledger, not to catch a thief, but to reconcile a world to itself. She asked Karim what the bread cost. She asked Bako how many times this month a child had been booked for food theft. She asked Aziz how many forms sit unsigned because a guardian never arrives. She asked Fatima if anyone had ever come from the social office to ask what hunger looks like at 8 in the morning. Questions are small chisels. They make space where doors are too tight. Ibrahim stepped back to include the community that had gathered like weather. He let them see the boy eating, the bread half gone and his shoulders lowering into safety. He spoke to the market, not to the camera phones. He said the city would change the sequence. No child would be taken from a market to a cell without being fed. And no petty theft of food would move faster than a referral to aid. And no station would collect coins for hunger cases, because the coins had become a perverse gravity. He spoke of a simple rule with a name easy enough to text in less than a breath. First meal rule, treat first, bill later. The sergeant protested in the key of order. He warned that mercy misread as weakness breeds chaos. He tapped the ledger, as if the book itself were a co-signer to his caution. Ibrahim reached for the ledger with care, lifted it, and set it next to the bread. He explained that the city's first ledger was the people's breath, and the second ledger was the law. The law could not be allowed to check out faster than the breath could check in. The market, hearing its own truth spoken back to it, exhaled. He asked for a phone charger. Aisha handed hers without looking up. He connected to the station's Wi-Fi and opened a blank page on the city's public site. He dictated slowly so the words would find their weight. From this hour, hunger cases trigger the first meal rule. Door to help target, 15 minutes. Denials in last 24 hours, to be published daily. Complaints channel, WhatsApp and USSD code. Funding stream, Central Emergency Kitty. No station-level retention. He asked the sergeant to repeat the code aloud to the room. Paco did, stumbling at first, then stronger. The door had caught a draft and begun to swing. The last act of the intervention was not the photograph of Ibrahim and Amir standing side by side. It was the quiet detail that followed. Ibrahim moved to the drawer, pulled it open, took out the carbon books, and signed a temporary suspension slip with his pen. He placed the slip on the desk like a new hinge. He nodded to Aziz, who understood the kind of order that comes when a gate is repurposed to open. He told the boy to finish eating, and then to take a loaf home. He told Karim that the city would reimburse him before sunset through mobile money. He told the market that the law had not been overturned, only resequenced to put breath before billing. The room held the change like a held breath becoming air. The city's appetite for spectacle faded by afternoon, but its appetite for answers remained. The incident had punctured a membrane and revealed a system damp with unexamined costs. Aisha convened a small team that behaved like a lantern. They started where stories like this always start, in the ledgers. At the bakery, Karim opened his book without defensiveness. Every loaf was accounted for. Every bag of flour registered with the municipal office by stamped receipt. His loss from the morning was a number so small it embarrasses a city to see how large a machine had been assembled to crush it. At the police post, they audited the petty fines drawer with a white sheet on the table and evidence envelopes. They found, under the organized chaos, a pattern like stairs. The more hunger cases processed, the smoother the station's cash flow. No one had invented corruption. Someone had invented a gate and then starved. They traced the funding streams that fed these small lengths of iron. Petty offense fines were allowed to offset station necessary incidentals, a phrase so broad you could drive a pickup through it. Administrative directives had been written 6 years ago, then amended twice, each time increasing the percentage the station could keep from on-the-spot penalties. Each memo was signed by someone who had never been to the market before noon. The team found a WhatsApp group for station commanders where members swapped tactics for meeting the ledger, which meant meeting quotas without causing noise. One text read, "Food theft easier. No counsel. Quick turn." The words made their own weather. They walked the corridor to the social office. Its door locked at 2:30 p.m., a paper sign explaining the clerk was in the field. Inside, a bulletin board announced programs with posters printed in years when the colors were brighter. There was a referral form that bakers could fill out, but it required an ID and a proof of address and a witness. The machine for compassion had been built to process paper, not people. The team sat with the one clerk still present, a tired woman who kept her sweater on in heat, as if warmth might be borrowed in layers. She explained that their meal voucher program ran out by the first week of each month. She unlocked a cabinet and showed them the empty roll of voucher books, the cardboard core a small private grief. "We receive staplers faster than funds," she said, and smiled because the joke kept her from crying. The investigation named names where naming was safe and named mechanisms where it was not. It discovered middlemen who camped at the social office door and offered to help applicants for a fee. It identified a vendor, a cousin to a cousin, who overcharged for the voucher paper. It revealed that the police post reported hunger cases as miscellaneous theft, a category that hid bodies under furniture. Aisha compiled the facts with a mathematician's patience. She plotted incidents on a simple dashboard she could hold in her palm. Door-to-help minutes often exceeded 2 hours. Denials in the last 24 hours spiked at month's end. Complaints resolved were measured in days when the first meal rule demanded minutes. She asked the guard, Aziz, to speak plainly. He said he had chased the boy and hated himself for running so well. He explained that their performance appraisals praised processing efficiency, which counted forms filed, not harms averted. He said that sometimes the city itself made the fastest door the wrong door. She asked Fatima whether she had ever been told to call anyone other than the police when a child hovered at the window too long. Fatima shook her head. She said her grandmother used to keep a small loaf aside every day for the unseen, a ritual that had evaporated when the city insisted every crumb be receipted. The frame tightened. They discovered this memorandum that allowed station-level retention was tied to a budget shortfall 3 administrations ago. The intent had been temporary, a bridge pushed across a stream in flood. The bridge had remained when the water went down. That is how perverse incentives survive. They become furniture no one notices until a child bumps into it and bleeds. Aisha drafted the exposure report with sentences stripped to the bone. Petty fine retention creates a preference for rapid petty bookings. Hunger cases become revenue. Market vendors are not integrated into aid referral. Social office chronically underfunded. Voucher procurement correct. She attached screenshots of the WhatsApp messages with names redacted. She appended a chart with 3 lines. Door to help median minutes, petty fine intake, voucher availability, that moved together like a confession. They published at dusk, when the market light thins and the city listens without interruption. The report did not accuse men. It accused mechanics. It did not howl. It named. Ibrahim stood behind it, without casting a shadow over the workers who would have to carry the change. He addressed the sergeant with dignity, reminding him that service was a door and not a drawer. He addressed the vendors, promising repayment in units that would arrive as text messages and not handshakes. He addressed the mothers, promising that the first meal rule would make hunger the city's emergency before it became the child's crime. The exposure ricocheted through the circuitry that had grown used to itself. No one slept badly because of a scandal. People slept restlessly because of a mirror. The next morning, a baker in another district messaged Karim to say a boy had hovered at his window, and he had handled it with a sandwich and a phone call. The investigation, like any door worth its frame, did not slam. It swung and invited other doors to notice their hinges. Change to matter must be as simple as a rule, as visible as a door, and as boring to maintain as brushing teeth. Ibrahim stood again in the market, not to dramatize, but to instruct. The first meal rule fit in 6 words that even a frayed billboard could carry. Treat first, bill later. He repeated it until the crowd could finish it aloud. He paired the rule with a mechanism that eliminated guesswork, a public metric board updated in real time and posted at 3 places: the station, the social office, and a city website so light it could load in the worst data weather. The board carried only 3 lines, simple enough to memorize unintentionally. Door to help minutes, rendered as a number that counted down in green if the child was fed within 15 minutes and blinked in red if it exceeded. Denials in last 24H, a whole number that insisted on being 0. Complaints resolved with a time to resolution target of 4 hours. There were no pie charts, no technocratic murals, just numbers that shamed or praised by their own candor. Beside the board, a printed sheet named the channels, a WhatsApp number and a USSD code reachable from the oldest phone in a handbag. Each complaint generated a ticket ID that behaved like a little leash attached to the city's ankle. You could tug and someone had to turn around. He removed the perverse slope in the floor. The suspension of station-level petty fine retention became a permanent ban for hunger-related and minor subsistence offenses. Central funding would cover the cost of emergency food and restitution, routed directly to vendors' mobile wallets. Auditors would trace each payment like a bead in a rosary. The city created a tiny emergency kitty fed by a fraction of parking fees, an irony that pleased no one and offended few. The paper vendor with the cousin lost his contract to a competitive bid that cared for price like a baker cares for yeast. The voucher books returned, numeric and unexciting. Training had to be smaller than fear. Ibrahim designed a drill with the help of workers who preferred chairs to meetings. They called it the 15-minute path. At each bakery and market stall, a laminated card explained the steps like a recipe. A child hovers. You greet, you offer a portion, you dial or text, you mark the time on the card with a pen, you carry on. At the station, the drill required a cup of tea be set in front of the child before any form. Officers rolled their eyes at first, then the rhythm caught. In the first week, the card's edges grew glossy with use. Aisha established a monthly culture check. A meeting not of chiefs, but of doers. Fatima from the bakery, Aziz from the guard line, Essa the community voice, a clerk from the social office, 2 mothers who had called the number. They met in a room with windows that opened. They read the 3 numbers aloud. They told the stories behind the ticks. The meetings lasted exactly 45 minutes. The agenda was 1 page. The tea was always the same. Boredom grew like moss, and moss is how stone stays moist enough not to crack. Accountability had to be gentle and sharp. The prosecutor's office reviewed only cases where the first meal rule had been violated willfully. 2 officers received warnings. 1 supervisor was reassigned to logistics where his love for forms could cause less harm. A memo written in more human than legal language explained the why in paragraphs without bullets. Karim's was reimbursed that same day, a ping on his phone that made him laugh alone in his shop. He framed the text on the wall next to his hygiene certificate, not to boast, but to remember the sense in the sequence. Breath, then billing. Ibrahim walked the city's other gates. He visited a bus terminal where a conductor had thrown a boy off for lack of fare. He visited a clinic where a nurse wrestled with charging before treating. He visited a registry office where a birth certificate lay hostage to a small, outstanding fee. At each door, he slid the first meal rule like a token and watched it click. He told leaders at these thresholds that they were not lesser or greater than the law. They were its lungs. He insisted the same 3 metrics be posted in each domain, adjusted for context but not in spirit. The city began to rhyme. The reform found its teeth in repetition. Radio hosts mentioned door-to-help numbers with weather updates. A teacher asked her students to recite the complaint code along with the alphabet. A baker in a far quarter added "first meal honored here" to his chalkboard beneath the day's price for millet bread. At the station, the fan still clicked, but the drawer did not sing. The poster of penalties returned to the wall with a companion sheet printed in bold. Sequence matters, first meal before any measure. The market saw time change shape. The hour between 7 and 8 ceased to be a gauntlet for small thieves. It became a practice for a city learning the choreography of care. 6 months later, the market smelled of oranges and engine oil and continuance. Bread still rose. It always will. The bakery's glass still fogged when the first loaves came out, but the fog no longer felt like a child's breath on a gate. The laminated card by the register had rounded corners now from cleaning. The ink had not faded because Fatima had copied it in her careful hand on cardstock and taped it beneath a tiny calendar. There was a new habit in the way Karim stacked the breads. 1 small loaf near the edge, an invitation that required no speech. He no longer watched the door like a guard. He watched it like a host. The metric board at the station had become furniture of a useful kind. Door-to-help minutes hovered between 7 and 9 most days, dipping below 5 on mornings when the sergeant arrived early with a pot of tea that embarrassed his older habit. Denials in the last 24 hours stayed at 0 so long that the digit burned into memory like a watermark. Complaints resolved ticked steadily, sometimes with little apologies attached in the log for delays caused by rain or a broken phone. The board's numbers became radio shorthand. When a talk show guest tried to spin a story into fear, the host casually asked, "And what's your door to help today?" Tone is a system, too. Aziz trained new guards by walking them the 15-minute path, not as an orientation, but as a stroll. He showed them the gate they used to chase through and the table where they now pour tea. He told them about a day when he had run after a boy and loved the speed and hated the result. He laughed when he said it, the kind of laugh men use to admit change without losing face. He carried himself differently now, not lighter exactly, but more aligned, like a door rehung after years of scraping the frame. In his pocket, alongside the station keys, he kept a folded piece of paper with the USSD code. A talisman. A reminder. Aisha's dashboard no longer sat on her home screen because it no longer required urgent attention. It had been tucked into a folder labeled Steady. The first time she did that, she felt a pang of superstition, and then breathed. Culture check meetings remained, their minutes as unremarkable as grocery lists. They compared notes on the price of flour and the speed of mobile money disbursement. They recorded a glitch in the website that made the complaint form disappear on old phones. It was fixed by afternoon. Karim sometimes sent pastries, not as tribute, but because sharing food had finally returned to its basic dignity. A social act, not a loophole. Ibrahim walked without cameras in places that had stopped needing drama. At the clinic, he watched a nurse greet a mother before asking for a card. At the bus terminal, he watched a conductor wave a boy into a seat and make a quiet note on a paperclip attached to the fare book. At the registry, a clerk slid a birth certificate under the window and said the fee could wait, a sentence that would have been impossible in the old grammar. He spoke less in these months. Leaders should be quiet when systems make the right sounds. He read more ledgers than headlines still. He kept a weather eye for perverse incentives, which creep like ivy and claim humanity by inches. The boy, Amir, had grown in all the ways that matter. He still walked by the bakery each morning, but he did not hover like a decision waiting to make itself. He bought, sometimes, and sometimes accepted when Fatima slipped him the end piece warm from the shelf. His mother's cough had settled with clinic syrups that had not asked to be prepaid. He had a new practice of his own. Whenever he held bread, he carried one piece with ceremony to the step of their neighbor, an old woman whose family sent money late. It was not charity. It was grammar, learned from a city that had rearranged its sentence. Isa, the porter with the cap, liked to sit in the shade and narrate to anyone who would risk being recruited to story. He told them there are doors, and there are gates, and there are ledgers, and none of them love anyone. People love, and sometimes they lean on doors to make them open faster. He liked to say the first meal rule had become like the call to prayer. Even those who did not heed it heard it several times a day and arranged themselves around its fact. He would point at the board as if pointing at the sky's reliability. Sometimes a visiting official would ask Ibrahim how to replicate the reform elsewhere, pen poised to capture a secret. He would speak about sequence and perverse incentives and the boredom of maintenance. He would say that numbers have to be few, names have to be known, and money has to refuse the shortest path to the wrong drawer. He would say that the shocking thing, if there was any shock at all, was not what he did that day in the station. It was what ordinary people do every day now without needing him. A city can build a habit like a muscle. The muscle lifts, not the man watching it. The market settled into its repetition, the highest form of praise a city can offer to those who need it most. The boy's breath no longer fogged the glass as a plea. It fogged it as proof he was near. The door opened and closed in a rhythm no longer worth noting. The ledger turned its pages with the light sound of thin paper. If anyone insisted on drama, they could find it in the quiet, strange miracle of a system doing what it promised. And if one asked what shocked everyone, Karim would say it was simple. We learned to put breath before billing, and then we kept doing it long after the cameras left. That, in the city, is the rarest kind of spectacle. For those who believe breath should come before billing, thank you for walking this road with us. If this story stirred something useful, an idea, a question, a next step, carry it to someone who needs it. And if you like the video, then like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your small actions move big doors. Until the next chapter, take care of your neighbors and let justice become a habit where you live.